So attribution science is still quite new, especially when we come into attributing particular events. So we can be really confident if we say, is climate change caused by man-made emissions? We're at least 95% confident in that, given that you can look at the IPCC reports. But when it comes down to actual extreme events, then it's a lot more tricky because we know that our climate's really variable, and when you take it down to like a city level, day to day, that sort of stuff is more related to weather than climate. We're just starting to be able to say a lot more about those extreme events, so flooding events, droughts, heat waves, but we can't really attribute any one particular event. All we can say really is that the likelihood of that event occurring has increased or not. So in the case of a typhoon, it's really quite tricky to say that is definitely climate change, and it's definitely too soon to say anything about Hagupit. That research will be done in good time, so hopefully next year we might be able to say something about that, but at the moment it's too early.
And what kind of information would you need to be able to make that call? Is it a case of having better technology, or would you need to be able to look over decades rather than years in terms of how things have changed?
Definitely decades. So you need really good observational data, and that's part of the problem. Is that actually our climate observations? You think that we must have decades and decades of data from all over the world, and actually it's not quite as good as that. So a lot of data still remains in paper form. It needs to be digitised. So certainly when we get to away from North America or Europe, we really have quite a lack of data to be able to say things confidently about extreme events. So firstly it's data, but then it's also the climate models. We need to know that those climate models can replicate things like storms. You know, they're very small scale things actually, and if you think about the climate model resolution is quite large. It deals with grid boxes, not with point observations. So we do need a really high-tech modelling capacity, and we need really powerful computers to run all that information.
It seems there are certain areas in the world where scientists are becoming increasingly certain about specific events. I remember there was a paper, I think it was a year ago, by the Met Office talking about drought in Northeast Africa. I mean, as far as you're concerned, are there some areas around the world where your understanding is becoming clearer? You've mentioned there are obviously other areas where the data isn't quite good enough, but are there some areas where you're thinking, well, you know, we've got a clearer idea?
Do you mean whether of that event is caused by climate change? Yeah, so for Northeast Africa, actually, that's one of the areas that we haven't quite yet been able to pin down whether those events are climate change or not. So certainly last year there was a report produced, and actually it's an annual report now, which tries to attribute the extreme events of that year to climate change, and it reports on whether we can attribute them or not. So sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. And certainly for 2013, the drought over East Africa was not attributable to climate change. There were some other things that we were quite confident that the likelihood of those events occurring had increased. So things like heat waves over the UK. It's always easier with temperature than it is with rainfall. Rainfalls are much more variable. So that it's going to take a lot longer. We need more data to say anything confidently about precipitation.
Last week there was another big report from the World Meteorological Organization, and also from the UK Met Office that seemed to be launched together, talking about how hot 2014 could be. From your perspective, how significant is that data? Everyone seems to be bombarded by monthly reports from NOAA, the US agency, month on month, saying this is the warmest month, and next one's the warmest month since records began. From your perspective, how significant is this data that was released last week?
How significant? So in terms of, is 2014 the warmest year on record, I think that's not so important. What's more important is that actually collectively the last 14 years of record have been part of the 15 warmest years on record, and I think that is a much stronger statement. Year to year there's quite a lot of variability, so any one year the actual uncertainty in the numbers, so 2014 is 0.57 degrees above average, 2010 was 0.56 degrees above average, but if you take the uncertainty on that, it's plus or minus 0.1, so those two actually overlap. So the year itself is not that significant, but take it in the context of the larger period. The last 14 years on record have been part of the 15 warmest years on record, and we're really in the warmest period on record since at least the 1880s.
Do those figures include records about warming oceans, or are they just land surface temperatures?
Those ones in particular include the warming oceans as well.
And is that another area where scientists are becoming increasingly clear about sort of how different parts of the planet are changing?
Yeah, we're increasing our knowledge base all the time. We now observe the oceans vertically as well as horizontally, and that's really important because what we've learned is that a lot of heat is stored in the oceans and actually stored at different layers, and that's enabled us to really to try and understand the slowdown in global temperatures that we've seen recently. But if we didn't have those observations, there are things called Argo floats, and they go up and down in the ocean, and they give us just so much information that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago.
And do you find, is it hard for climate scientists in general, when there is so much pressure, particularly at this venue, for real clarity? People, I guess, would like to see a straight line in terms of temperatures. Are they going up, or are they sort of pausing or stalling? What's going on? Is that a real, how do you guys find that in terms of a challenge, in terms of your work and being able to be as clear as you possibly can without, I guess, blurring the lines?
Well, as a scientist, I think we're always very cautious about getting as close to the truth as possible, but not over-exaggerating what we see in the data. So it's really difficult because people want something very simple, very clear, and actually sometimes it's not that simple and it's not that clear, and there are always uncertainties, but we just try and be as transparent as possible about those uncertainties. But it's pretty clear that we're in the warmest period on record, so we can say that really confidently and really robustly. But there are always uncertainties on, like how much has Paris warmed by, how much has Lima warmed by, and those sort of, when you take it down to the details on the ground, there are greater uncertainties there than in things like the global average.
Final question: is your kind of, it seems that one of your takeaway points is that you've got to look at the big picture rather than sort of either small select areas or months or years.
I think it depends what you want to do. You've got to look at both. So if you want to ask the question, is the climate changing, it's better to look at the bigger picture because you've got lower variability. So it's a signal to noise ratio. The signal stands out much more. If you want to know actually how it's going to impact people, then we really need to look at those details. We need to look at hourly data, daily data. We need to look at many, many stations all over the world. And that's where the uncertainties are largest. So that's a much trickier thing to do, but it's really important because we've got to adapt to climate change.